Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the new episode of Culture in Conversation, where we discuss how culture is experienced in everyday life. My name is Chan-Hoong. I'm the host of this podcast, and today I'm very privileged to have Dr. Ronald Fischer, distinguished researcher at the Dior Institute for Research and Education in Brazil. And Ron is also the editor for Current Directions in Ecological and Social Psychology and a fellow of the Royal Society of New Zealand and Association for Psychological Science. How are you today? Welcome aboard, Ron. How are you?
Good morning. Good morning.
Hi.
I'm good. I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you so much. Thanks. Well, Ron, let's talk about something that is probably closer to your heart. Talk about your personal journey, if you like. We all know you've traveled a lot, in the past 20, 30 years. And I still remember the late Professor James Liu at Massey University. He always referred to you, talk about you very fondly as the Indiana Jones in cross-cultural psychology because you travel so extensively in so many other parts of the world. You were born in Germany, you studied in the UK, you work in New Zealand, and you've traveled extensively to almost all corners of the globe. And now you're residing in Brazil. Just want to, perhaps, get your kind of perspective. How has it been? What has been the greatest reward, if you like, as a cross-cultural nomad?
Right. First of all, it's a funny reference because I grew up behind the Iron Curtain. And so, like the reference of Indiana Jones, something that I just learned or, got to know much later in life. So, so it's kind of funny because, why Indiana Jones, if you really think about it, it's kind of a colonial character. It's kind of not the best reference.
Not very
um,
cross-culturally sensitive, yeah?
uh, I mean, like what's the greatest reward? I don't actually think about it in this way, but like I've been really lucky, like first of all, growing up behind the Iron Curtain, we were not able to travel, and so ever since I was a small child, I wanted to see the world. Like I was, like madly reading all these adventure books that were available back then. A lot of like English classics and stuff like that. And I always wanted to see the world. As a kid, I was always imagining, I grew up in the countryside, so like I would go on my little walks because there was not a lot of stuff around, and then would imagine, like going through a little forest, like what would it be like if I was in the Amazon, for example. So I always wanted to see the world, and I think that's for me the greatest reward that I've been able to see and at least get to know a little bit, a lot of different places around the world. And I still, to the extent possible, like I still try and see different places. Like at some stage in my life, I had to go like, let's see if I can get to see 2 new places a year. It's a bit more difficult now with the family. But I find this the most interesting part, like traveling, getting to meet new people, talking to new people. I find this most exciting and most rewarding, actually.
Well, you talk about Amazon, and right now you're in Brazil, the perfect place to visit the Amazon, isn't it? Um, you know,
It's a long way away from here, where I
that's
am.
true. Well, fair enough, fair enough. You have you publish an eclectic range of topics from leadership in IO psychology to cross-cultural behaviors, on mental health, personality, linguistics, evolution. So these are all topics that tend to be kind of distinctive and kind of independent from each other. I'm just curious, like in your experience and your heaps of publications, do you find anything common that binds them together, in spite of that eclectic topics that you cover in the research?
Well, for me, everything is always kind of connected, so I don't necessarily see them as quite separate as such. I think like the way I do research is very curiosity driven. Right? So I'm curious about stuff, and I think this is what I really enjoy about being a researcher. You can learn new stuff every day. I always try and read, if possible, 1 or 2 papers. It's challenging, but I always want to learn new things. Get a different perspective on stuff. And so then as soon as you start reading, questions start arising. Very often I'm also a lot of my research has been has started in conversations. So you talk to students. When I was back in New Zealand, a lot of research was in collaboration with students. So students bring their ideas, their questions, and then we start discussing stuff, or with colleagues, and then you just develop it from there. And I think for me, what binds everything kind of together is the human mind, and basically it sounds like cliche, right? But I'm these days I'm very much interested in questions like, for example, consciousness. What is it? How does it work? Can we ever get to it? And I think this is actually one of the points where culture comes in, because a number of, for example, cognitive theories of consciousness, they assume that we have these kind of top-down priors, so basically some schemas in our mind that help us make sense of our environment, right? And then this is like a cultural script, right? So this is culture in some very basic neurocognitive way. And so the way I see, all these different topics, from organizations to mental health and so on to, evolution, more basic biological explanations, is, trying to tackle these questions of culture in different spheres of life. So, if I study, for example, organizational processes, so we did a lot of stuff on commitment, organizational culture, and so on. It's how we can try and understand how these cultural scripts influence how people do work in different parts of the world with each other. Then, mental health is something that is important for a lot of different aspects of our lives, and the kind of scripts that we have about what it means to be healthy, what it means to have a good life, vary a lot in different, across the globe. So I often see connections between, different topics. And so for me, there's actually a natural progression between these things, exploring pretty much the same question, the interaction between the mind, very basic brain processes, then how we subjectively experience our world in different parts of the world, this classic kind of co-construction of mind and culture.
You and I have a lot in common in that we read and study very widely. I'm not sure, and I'm going to do a bit of a detour here in this interview to ask you about how you look at the current generation of students. Do you think we read enough? Do you think we read widely enough? And do you think we read enough of cross-culture? I mean, one of the gripes that I have as a teacher, as an instructor, is I think today's environment, because it's so short circuit, there's a lot, the attention span is a lot shorter, and I find that a lot of people don't read enough, and beyond what would be the disciplines. I don't know what would be your take, because you have taught students from all over the world. Do you see this as a challenge in this current generation, where attention span is short and you don't read as much, particularly on things that are relating to another culture, another environment? What are your thoughts on that?
Look, I mean, that's a really, really important question. At the moment, I'm mainly working as a researcher. I still do teaching, but it is more, at this moment, it's very much focused at a more postgrad level. So, you see already those students who have survived, the undergrad years, and have developed some kind of habit. Yeah, have developed certain habits. And I think, like the environment is very different from, for example, when I started off, like, so it's, like even like you can't compare the times anymore in the same way. And with that come, you see all sorts of other changes. Has our attention span changed? It's a really good empirical question. We should do some some project on that. But even if you think about, like social media is one thing, right? Okay, everyone these days is on TikTok and on like Instagram, whatever. Is it helpful? I'm not 100% convinced, because like you swap basically deeper thinking for very fast like snips of information that may or may not have a good basis. But the quick the flip side of the whole issue is also, like just the amount of research that is being conducted today. If you look at the number of journals that have appeared over the last like couple of decades, if you look at the number of papers that are coming out in different areas, it's a very different environment. Like these days, I don't need to go to the library anymore, right? So that, I really appreciate, though back in the days, like I would dedicate one day a week, back in Sussex, I would dedicate one day a week. I'll go to the library, physically go through, I would get the journals
The
out,
physical hard
flip
copy,
through them.
right? Yeah.
Yeah. And then, like I would think 3 times whether I copy it, like, because it was really expensive back in the days in the UK to copy an article. So first I would, read it, take notes, and I would think like 3 times, do I actually need it or not? These days, like I open my computer, I do a quick search on Google or whatever other platform, like AI these days suggests lots of like Notebook LM, like you type in a question, it already like suggests 10 references for you to look at. I download them. It actually is a very different intellectual environment, and you have to be very disciplined to go and actually read enough in an article to form an opinion, right? So and I think this, one of the problems that I see with some of the students that I interact with, is just creates anxiety. Like I talked to a couple of students here. I mean, and of course, cultural differences as well. Intellectual environments are very different. How you basically interact with information, how you interact with theories, to what extent you feel competent to criticize, for example, I think is also a major difference, comparing, for example, some of the English-speaking countries where I've worked, and comparing that, for example, locally. Students are very reluctant to criticize, and at the same time, like they want to read, or want to get to know stuff, and it takes time, right? So like I see a lot of anxiety as well, which may not be helped by the social media hype, where like you're constantly bombarded with like this idea and that idea and that idea, right? So is it a different time? Yeah. Do we need different skill sets to actually sift through research, identify what is interesting to pursue or not? Yes, we need different skill sets. Do we equip the students to do that? That's the part where I'm not sure about, So I think there's also a challenge for us as kind of educators to think through the challenges through, like the eyes of students, and rethink, for example, how we do teaching, or how we do, like our mentoring. And I think there are challenges for all of us. I don't know if that answers your question.
Absolutely. I mean, I totally agree. It's a very different generation, and I think the kind of environment call for a different approach. And I think this actually, this point kind of brings very neatly and nicely to the next question that I want to pick your brain, because you talk about cultural differences, right? And you have published extensively in the field of measurement invariance. and the whole idea of trying to measure constructs, latent constructs, whether that's similar or different between cultures and between people. And so much of our work in psychology has always been, built on the foundation of invariant ideas, so theoretically comparable across environment. And we do that with a whole range of statistical tools. So I mean, and it's nice that we talk about learning and about the different generation. Do you think the real world works in the way we conceptualize this, that we're trying to compare constructs, whether ideas about individualism and collectivism, ideas about social dominance in a very similar universal ways? Do you see the world as it is, like, there are certain universal beliefs and ideas, or increasingly, as we talk about the differences in terms of learning and different generations, that we cannot do that universal comparative anymore because it's a completely different culture, different environment, and the generations are different? What are your thoughts on that?
Right. I could. Wow. What a big question. What a great question, actually. And I could answer in like a number of different ways here. I maybe like let's maybe, I don't know where to tackle your questions from what angle, because like there are a lot of different ideas that I think are really important for us to discuss as a discipline, actually, and maybe to start with the most controversial part. Do I think individualism, collectivism exists as a, because there's this whole discussion right now with a new discipline, for example, culturology, that like people have proposed as a new discipline, and some of the proponents have argued, for example, individualism, collectivism, it's not real, but it's real. Researchers invent it, but it does things in the real world. And the issue that how should I enter into this fray? I'm thinking here. Ultimately, I think we are often too quick to quantify.
Too quick to quantify.
Yes, we're too quick to quantify. We don't do our homework enough in terms of trying to explore the problem as such. I think that is the, and it may sound strange from somebody who does mainly quantitative research. And I think there's a, there's a really big issue here, in the sense that, like researchers come up with survey items. And I think this actually in that relates back to your previous question in some way. We're living in very exciting times where the methods that we could potentially explore are expanding significantly. We are now able to collect data in ways that we would not have imagined, for example, 20 years ago or even 10 years ago, right? So we can get linguistic data, for example, language, either written or spoken language. Just think about YouTube, TikTok, and so on and so on, like people talking about stuff. And that opens up amazing opportunities and windows into the human mind. So I'm coming back to the idea of the mind, that allow us to get ideas of what is important to individuals and how these issues that are important to individuals change across different locations, but also change across time. And so it is much more dynamic. It's much more insightful to start looking at some of these type of data that are becoming available now, that are less rigid than surveys that we rely on. Like a survey is always created by, and we've been doing a lot of research here in Brazil over the last couple of years, actually very qualitative research, giving human participants from the general population. It started during the pandemic, so a lot of it is online, which is a limitation as well. But we gave people mental health related questions, but also questions that are related to experiences that are quite salient within certain religious cultural practices, right? And it is absolutely amazing how differently people interpret the same question, right? So even established inventories that are used a lot in psychiatric research and in social research and so on and so on, the way people interpret those questions varies a lot, right? So
Mm.
if we get the final numbers, like we often have no idea what actually led to that, single number that is now on the survey that I now put into some kind of fancy statistical routine, and I treat that further. So I think we are often too quick to try and quantify something based on ideas that we have in our mind, based on some theories that may or may not coincide with the lived realities, with the lived worlds of the individuals. And I think, there's all this kind of discussion at the moment around invariance. Do we need invariance or not? I think if you're really serious about culture, the invariance question is actually essential, and it can tell you where our culturally shaped ideas as researchers do not work in the real world. So for me, people are often very disappointed if a scale did not work, and my reaction as a person interested in culture, I would go like, wow, this is exciting. It did not work, so this actually tells you something went wrong. Your cultural assumptions about the world do not work. And so we should actually embrace it much more. It gives us the raw material to work with to try and understand that beast culture in new, right? Because at
Yes.
the end of the day, um, if you think about it, a scale is always very, very simple, unidimensional, very reductionist, whereas our cultural worlds are messy, complex, dynamic, and so on and so on. And I think, again, coming back to these methods that are becoming available right now. So, for example, we could go back using, for example, some of the uh, text that was written like 20 years ago, 50 years ago, and start looking at, for example, are students today, different from 20 or 30 years ago, because of the way that they write about their world. You can get a little bit of a snapshot about their concerns, about how they put words together, which is a statistical concept of word embedding, right? So we can see whether for example, anxiety is associated with the same words today as it was 20 or 30 or 50 years ago. And this is what people have started doing, and they have shown that even the words that we use, you may go back and read Hofstede, who wrote in the 60s and 70s leading up to his famous 1980 book that we all use as a foundation.
Yeah.
And probably if you start looking at how he put words together, we start realizing his mental worldview about culture was probably different from how we treat for example, individualism, collectivism today. So is invariance important? I think absolutely. And the only other thing that I would like to mention in terms of invariance, I loved invariance as a philosophical concept, right? Because it is the issue that philosophers like Thomas Nagel, with his famous what is it like to be a bat question, a bat flies around, uses
Yeah.
echolocation to position itself in a space. What does it feel like? And in a way, this is the same issue that we face as psychologists working with culture. What does it feel like to be Chan-Hoong doing this interview, in your evening in Singapore, or be any other person in the world, right? At the fundamental level, this is about invariance. How do you see the world? How can I, what are the common points between our perspectives that allow us to? Obviously, there is some shared understanding because we talk to each other, right? So at
Yeah.
some level, yes, there is invariance between the two of us, because we use a language, we use some words that are, like approximately similar for both of us, so we can talk to each other. But then there are other parts that are not. And I think this richness, like if you treat invariance as a kind of philosophical problem, like opens up really interesting new ways to think about culture. And what I find sad or disappointing in a way is that, one, we kind of ignore this rich tool set that is available, and the opportunities that this tool set offers us to rethink some fundamental problems about culture. And I also think, and this is something that is not new, like we try and quantify too much. Many years ago at a conference, at the IACCP conference, one of the professors said, like, we should issue a law that forbids the use of questionnaires in cross-cultural research. That was like 20 odd years ago at the IACCP.
Very revolutionary, yes. Yes.
But like in a way, like it is true, because like questionnaires probably they hide more than they reveal to some extent. They're useful.
Absolutely.
Like don't get me wrong, they're useful. But are they the full picture? Not sure.
Yeah. Yeah. You're right.
Long-winded answer.
Yes. I mean, I like, the way you explain this. I mean, this is so profoundly insightful, and particularly coming from somebody of your background, very quantitative, and talk about the challenge of being too quick to quantify, and the fact that, it's actually more interesting when it's not invariant, that there's differences between cultures in how we interpret those concepts. And I'm sure, our audience will find that perspective interesting and fascinating as well. I have just one question, Ron, that I'd like to, again, have you to share with our audience. Because you have traveled quite extensively in the globe for a quarter of a century. What do you think is the most fascinating and important takeaway you have, in understanding and unpacking culture and identity? I mean, I ask this, particularly in today's context, which is kind of an irony, because on the one hand, we have never been that close to one another in terms of culture. We're all interconnected, whether it's through cyberspace or through, international travel, and you have all these conferences and educational immersion programs, and of course, globalization, trade, and all that. But at the same time, we've never been that divided and polarized. And you, having traveled in the world for so many years, what will be your takeaway, number one takeaway in understanding culture? What would be the advice that you give to young researchers in cross-cultural psychology?
Wow. Good question. I think, one important point for me, and where I often have probably failed in my research, is the first point is always, the interface, talking to people, so language. If you're unable to communicate with people, then that really creates some major challenges to be able to understand. And the second point, I think, also is like, let's breathe and relax first a little bit, right? Which also is a bit strange coming from me, because I'm this hyperactive guy, always on the go, doing a lot of things. But actually, slowing down sometimes can be beneficial if you want to understand the perspective of others, and try and understand, where they're coming from, especially in this very, as you mentioned, polarized world, right? So we have polarization probably in each and every country, where it gets more and more difficult to actually understand what the other side is thinking or doing. So, and again, it probably comes down to the same issues, language, and, let's sit down, breathe, and start talking to each other, which is Yeah, have a
Yes.
beer, have a cup of tea, have a coffee, whatever, um, and this is challenging. Like, again, it comes back to, like a very fast world that we live in. Like, how many times in your day, like, just think about your actual professional day. How many times a day do you actually have half an hour where you could go down to like, I don't know, to a coffee store, sit down, and then have a real chat to somebody, right? It is very difficult. It's very challenging. Like, for example, here in Brazil, we send each other voice messages all the time, which is, like on WhatsApp or whatever other, like, I don't know if you do it that much in Singapore. It's good and it's bad, because on one hand, you actually talk to people. On the other hand, it's asynchronous. Right. So is it good? Yeah. Is it bad? Oh, yes, as well, because you don't really talk to each other, right? So you constantly, send snippets of ideas, which is good. You can contextualize already a little bit more. But yeah, I think you were talking about, like, what advice would you give people today? Like, I think just thinking about some of the students that have been interacting here locally, the first, it's always bad to ask for advice, I think, because like, the world is changing, and I think like, a lot of times we probably should first listen to the students first and to their concerns and issues, right? And so I can only just reflect on some of the things that I have picked up from some conversations, and the things that are most clearly on my mind at the moment is, like, relax, like, like,
Take it easy. Yeah.
take it easy. You're not going to change the world, and it's okay not to change the world, or like, to make a groundbreaking breakthrough with your research. Like, everything is like, you build a house with a lot of little stones. Like, if you add one little stone to like a construction that is in progress, that is good, that is sufficient. And like, it's as we had mentioned already, it's very different times from, for example, when I started out, or when you started out. And so whatever people like ourselves tell students, it also has to be considered with a grain of salt, right? Because we come from different times, different backgrounds.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but like, in terms of culture, if we think about culture, one important issue is really language. Trying to study language, try to learn language, and the other one really is, slow down, relax, breathe, sit, live with somebody that you don't understand yet, and then like, take it slowly.
That's a very good advice, Ron. I love it, particularly coming from yourself, and I love the part that you mentioned a while ago about going to the library and collecting the physical journals, the print journals, and then browse through and take your time to decide and filter. I think those are things that we don't see a lot today, and in our haste to get the next article published, we just grab as much journal articles as possible without filtering, without thinking through. This is so great. Thank you so much, Ron. I really appreciate you coming to this program and to share with us some of your perspective on cross-cultural psychology. I hope to have you back again in future episodes. And yes, and certainly, I think a lot of the community of cross-cultural psychologists would love to see you, in future conferences. Thank you so much, Ron.
Thank you, and have a good evening.
Thank you. All right. Bye-bye.